Welcome back to HOA Meltdown Moments. The appeal window closed before it opened. I stepped out of my apartment at 6 in the morning, keys in hand, and Catherine was already standing next to my car with her phone to her ear and a tow truck reversing into position behind her. "You missed the deadline, and now you get the consequences," she said, waving one hand at the yellow curb paint that stopped a full car length away from where I had parked. I blinked the sleep out of my eyes and tried to process what was happening. I live in Arlington, Texas, in a place called Stonehaven, and the HOA here has a compliance officer who treats guest parking like a federal crime. I work as a union electrician apprentice, and my job site start time is strict. If my car gets towed, I lose a day of pay and possibly my spot on the crew rotation. Catherine was already peeling a bright warning sticker off a roll and slapping it on my driver's side window, talking into her phone about authorization and plate numbers. I said, "That is not a fire lane. The yellow paint ends right there." Catherine did not look up. She said, "You can be mad or you can be compliant." The tow driver climbed out of his truck and started lowering the wheel lift, and I realized I had about 30 seconds before my car was on a hook and I was on foot. I pulled out my phone and started recording. Catherine saw the camera and her expression shifted from smug to furious in an instant. She said, "You do not have permission to film me." I said, "I am on HOA property and you are enforcing HOA rules in public. So yes, I do." She stepped closer and I could see the stack of pre-filled violation forms clipped to a board under her arm, boxes already checked, just waiting for a plate number and a signature. The tow driver asked Catherine if she had the authorization paperwork, and she held up a laminated card that said Stonehaven HOA Compliance Officer in bold letters. He shrugged and kept working. I said, "I need to see the board resolution that gives you the authority to authorize tows." Catherine said, "I have done this before and people fold every time." That line stuck in my head because it was not a rule citation, it was a threat based on past success. I kept my voice low because my trump card needed perfect timing and I was not ready to use it yet. I needed her to commit fully to this story first. The tow driver hooked the chain under my rear axle and I felt my chest tighten. I said, "If you tow this car without proper authorization, I will file a complaint with the city and the management company." Catherine laughed. She said, "The management company reports to the board and I am the board compliance officer, so good luck with that." I pulled up the Stonehaven HOA portal on my phone and started scrolling through the parking rules. The fire lane section was clear, yellow curb paint plus signage, and my spot had neither. I held the phone up and showed her the screen. She glanced at it and said, "That rule is outdated." I said, "It is dated this year." She said, "The board amended it verbally at the last meeting." I said, "Show me the minutes." She said, "They are not published yet." A kid on a bike came around the corner, saw the tow truck and the argument, and braked hard to watch. Catherine turned and waved him off, but he stayed put, 1 foot on the curb, phone already out. I realized I had a witness with a camera angle I did not have, and that changed the math. The tow driver said, "Ma'am, if he is saying it is not a fire lane, I need to see the authorization in writing, or I am going to unhook and leave." Catherine pulled a folded sheet of paper from her clipboard and handed it to him. He read it, frowned, and handed it back. He said, "This just says you can call for a tow if a vehicle is in violation. It does not say what the violation is." Catherine said, "The violation is blocking emergency access." He said, "But the curb is not painted here." She said, "It does not need to be painted if it is obviously a fire lane." He looked at me, then back at her, and said, "I am not taking this one." He started unhooking the chain. Catherine said, "I am calling your supervisor." The tow driver said, "Go ahead," and he climbed back into his truck and drove off. Catherine turned to me and said, "This is not over." She took a photo of my license plate with her phone, then another photo of my car in the spot, then a wide shot of the lot. I said, "Why are you taking pictures if I am not in violation?" She said, "Documentation." I said, "For what?" She said, "For the next step." She walked off without another word, and I got in my car and drove to work, but my hands were shaking the whole way. That night, I got an email from the Stonehaven HOA management portal. Subject line, "Notice of violation." The body of the email said I had parked in a restricted fire lane and that I owed a $200 fine due in 14 days, plus a mandatory compliance meeting with Catherine. I opened the attached photos and saw my car in the spot, but the angle made it look closer to the yellow curb than it actually was. The second photo was a close-up of the curb paint, cropped so you could not see where it ended. The third photo was a shot of a fire lane sign 2 buildings over, nowhere near my spot. I screenshotted everything and sent it to my cousin, who is a local attorney I know through family. He called me an hour later and said, "This is selective enforcement and possibly fraud. Save everything. Do not pay the fine. Request a hearing. File a complaint with the management company and the board. And document every interaction from now on." I replied to the violation email and requested a hearing. I attached the parking rule from the portal and a satellite image of the lot with measurements showing my car was not in the fire lane zone. I copied the management company and the board president. Catherine replied within 10 minutes. She said, "Your hearing is scheduled for next Tuesday at 7 in the evening in the clubhouse. Attendance is mandatory. Failure to attend will result in automatic escalation to collections." I felt my stomach drop because Tuesday was a job site day and I could not afford to miss it, but I also could not afford to let this go to collections. I emailed my cousin again and he said, "Go to the hearing. Bring printed copies of everything. Bring a witness if you can. Record it if Texas law allows, which it does as long as one party consents, and you are a party." The next day, I got a text from my neighbor across the hall. He said, "Did you see the group chat?" I opened the Stonehaven neighborhood group chat and saw a post from Catherine with my license plate and a photo of my car. The caption said, "Reminder that fire lane parking is a safety hazard and repeat offenders will be towed on site. No warnings." The post had 15 reactions and 3 comments, all agreeing with her. One person said, "I saw someone arguing with the tow truck this morning. Maybe that is the same car." Another said, "If you cannot follow the rules, move somewhere else." I felt my face flush. I typed a reply explaining that my car was not in a fire lane and that I had requested a hearing, but before I could hit send, Catherine posted again. She said, "Residents who dispute valid violations in the group chat will be subject to additional fines for harassment." I deleted my draft and closed the app. I called my cousin and told him about the group chat post. He said, "Screenshot it, then report it to the management company as defamation and harassment. If she is using HOA communication channels to publicly shame you before your hearing, that is a due process violation." I did what he said, then I went to work and tried to focus, but every time my phone buzzed, I expected another email or another group chat post. By the end of the week, I had 3 more emails from Catherine. One was a reminder about the hearing. One was a notice that guest parking was now restricted to vehicles with a valid guest pass displayed on the dashboard, and that any guest without a pass would be towed immediately. One was a notice that all residents were required to register their vehicles with the HOA within 7 days, or face a $50 registration fee. None of these rules had existed a month ago. On Monday night, my buddy from the job site came over to help me unload some tools from his truck. He parked in a guest spot near my building, and we carried the tools upstairs. When we came back down 20 minutes later, there was a bright warning sticker on his windshield, and Catherine was standing next to his truck with her phone out, taking photos. My buddy said, "What is this?" Catherine said, Guest parking requires a valid guest pass. He said, I did not know that. She said, ignorance is not an excuse. He said, where do I get a pass? She said, from the office, but the office is closed now, so your vehicle is in violation. She turned to me and said, you are responsible for informing your guests of the rules. This is your second violation in a week. I said, he was here for 20 minutes. She said, the rule does not have a time exception. My buddy peeled the sticker off his windshield and said, this is insane, and he got in his truck and left. Catherine wrote down his plate number and said, I will be sending him a citation for removal of an official HOA notice. If you are enjoying this story, please hit the like button and subscribe for more wild HOA drama where the rules get weaponized. I went to the hearing on Tuesday night with a folder full of printed documents, my phone fully charged, and my cousin on standby. The clubhouse was empty except for Catherine and one other board member, a man in his 60s who introduced himself as the treasurer. Catherine sat at the head of the table with her clipboard and her stack of pre-filled violation forms. She said, this hearing is to review your violation of Stonehaven Fire Lane parking rules on the morning of November 14th. You have 15 minutes to present your case. I laid out my printed satellite image, the parking rule from the portal, and my photos of the curb showing the yellow paint ended before my spot. I said, the rule requires yellow curb paint and signage, and my spot had neither. Catherine said, the rule was amended. I said, show me the amendment. She said, it was a verbal amendment at the October board meeting. I said, show me the minutes. She said, the minutes are not finalized yet. I said, then the amendment does not exist. The treasurer shifted in his seat and said, Catherine, do we have draft minutes? She said, they are on my laptop at home. I said, I also have screenshots of the neighborhood group chat where you posted my plate number and accused me of being a repeat offender before this hearing even happened. That is a due process violation. Catherine said, the group chat is not an official HOA channel. I said, you posted it using your compliance officer title, and you threatened additional fines for anyone who disputed you. That makes it official. The treasurer said, Catherine, is that true? She said, I was reminding residents of the rules. He said, but did you post his plate number? She did not answer. I pulled up the screenshot on my phone and showed it to him. He leaned back and said, we need to table this and consult with the management company. Catherine said, we do not need to do that. He said, yes, we do. She stood up and said, fine. This hearing is continued to next week. I said, I want a written confirmation that the fine is suspended pending the continuation. The treasurer said, agreed, and he made a note on his phone. I left the clubhouse and called my cousin. He said, good work, they are scrambling now. Keep pressure on them. File a formal complaint with the management company about the group chat post and the hearing procedure. I did that the next morning. The management company replied the same day and said they were opening an internal review. Catherine did not respond. 2 days later, I got a notice in the mail that my guest parking privileges were suspended pending resolution of my violation case. I called the management company and they said Catherine had submitted a request for the suspension and they had approved it because it was within her authority as compliance officer. I said, how can you suspend my guest parking when the underlying violation has not been proven? They said, the suspension is a temporary measure to prevent further violations. I said, that makes no sense. They said, you can appeal the suspension at the next board meeting. The next board meeting was not for 3 weeks. I realized Catherine was trying to isolate me, making it impossible for anyone to visit me without risking a tow. My buddy from work said he would not come back to my place until this was resolved. My sister canceled a weekend visit because she did not want to deal with HOA hassle. I felt the walls closing in. I started keeping a log of every interaction, every email, every notice. I pulled invoices from the tow company and found a pattern. Over the last 6 months, Stonehaven had called the same vendor 43 times, and Catherine had personally authorized 37 of those calls. The invoices showed her name in the authorization field every time. I cross-referenced the dates with board minutes and found no record of the board approving a preferred vendor contract. I sent the invoices to my cousin, and he said, "This smells like a kickback scheme, or at minimum an undisclosed relationship. You need to raise this at the board meeting." A week before the continued hearing, Catherine posted in the group chat again. She said, "Effective immediately, all street parking is prohibited between midnight and 6 in the morning. Violators will be towed without warning." Someone asked, "Where is this rule in the HOA documents?" Catherine said, "It is a safety and access rule consistent with the board's general authority." Someone else said, "I work nights and I need to park on the street sometimes." Catherine said, "You can apply for an exemption, but exemptions are reviewed on a case-by-case basis and are not guaranteed." I realized she was tightening the noose on everyone, not just me. I screenshotted the post and added it to my file. The continued hearing happened the following Tuesday. This time the full board was there: the president, the treasurer, the secretary, and Catherine. I brought my cousin with me. The president opened the meeting and said, "We are here to review the fire lane violation issued to the resident at Unit 214. Catherine, please present your case." Catherine stood and said, "The resident parked in a fire lane on November 14th and refused to move his vehicle when directed by HOA compliance. He also harassed me on social media and attempted to intimidate me during the tow process. I have photos and witness statements." She handed a folder to the president. I said, "I would like to respond." The president said, "You will have your turn." Catherine continued. She said, "The fire lane rule was amended in October to include any area within 15 feet of a fire hydrant or emergency access point, regardless of curb markings." I said, "There is no hydrant or emergency access point near my spot." She said, "There is a fire access gate 20 feet away." I pulled up the satellite image on my phone and showed the board. I said, "The gate is on the other side of the building. It is not visible from my spot and there is no line of sight." The treasurer said, "Catherine, is there signage indicating the expanded fire lane zone?" She said, "Signage is being installed next month." He said, "So there was no signage at the time of the violation?" She said, "Correct." He said, "Then how was the resident supposed to know?" She said, "Residents are expected to review the board minutes." I stood up and said, "I requested the minutes and you told me they were not finalized. The rule you are citing does not appear in any published document." The president said, "That is a fair point. Catherine, do we have draft minutes we can share?" She said, "They are at home." The president said, "Then we cannot enforce a rule that has not been published." Catherine said, "The board has general authority to enforce safety rules." I said, "Not retroactively, not without notice." The secretary, a woman in her 50s, said, "I agree." If the rule was amended in October and the minutes are not finalized, we cannot issue a violation for November. Catherine said, "Then what was the point of this hearing?" The president said, "To review the facts. And based on the facts, I think we need to rescind the fine and issue a written apology." Catherine stood up and said, "You are setting a dangerous precedent." The president said, "We are following our own procedures. The fine is rescinded. The secretary will send written confirmation by the end of the week." Catherine walked out of the meeting without another word. The president said, "I apologize for the confusion. We will be reviewing our compliance procedures to prevent this from happening again." I said, "I also want to raise a concern about the tow vendor relationship." I handed him the invoice log. I said, "Over the last 6 months, Catherine has authorized 37 tows, all using the same vendor, and there is no record of a board-approved contract. The president looked at the invoices and then looked at the treasurer. The treasurer said, "I was not aware of this." The president said, "We will add this to the agenda for next month's meeting." I said, "I also have evidence that Catherine posted my plate number and personal information in the neighborhood group chat before the hearing, and that she threatened other residents with fines if they disputed her." The secretary said, "That is a violation of our harassment policy." The president said, "We will address that as well." I left the meeting feeling like I had won a round, but I knew Catherine was not going to let this go. My cousin said, "You embarrassed her in front of the board. She is going to escalate. Be ready." The next morning, I got a text from a neighbor I barely knew. It said, "Someone posted your address and a photo of your car in a Facebook group about bad neighbors. I do not know who did it, but you should check it out." I found the group and saw the post. It had my address, my plate number, and a photo of my car with a caption that said, "This guy thinks fire safety rules do not apply to him." The post had over 100 comments, most of them calling me entitled and selfish. I reported the post to Facebook, and it was taken down within an hour, but the damage was done. People I did not know were commenting on neighborhood posts, asking if I was the guy who fought the HOA, and some of them were not friendly. 2 weeks later, my sister came to visit and parked in a guest spot. She called me from the lot and said, "There is a woman out here taking photos of my car and saying I need a guest pass." I went downstairs and found Catherine standing next to my sister's car with her clipboard. I said, "She is my guest, and she is parked in a guest spot." Catherine said, "She needs a pass." I said, "Where do I get a pass?" She said, "From the office, but you need to request 124 hours in advance." I said, "That was not the rule last month." She said, "The rule changed." I said, "Show me the notice." She said, "It was emailed to all residents." I checked my email on my phone and found nothing. I said, "I never got that email." She said, "That is not my problem." My sister said, "I am leaving," and she got in her car and drove off. Catherine said, "I am issuing a citation for unauthorized guest parking." I said, "You are harassing me and my family." She said, "You can be mad or you can be compliant." I went back to my cousin and said, "She is never going to stop." He said, "Then we escalate. File a complaint with the Texas Department of Insurance about the harassment claim and the tow vendor relationship. If the HOA's insurance carrier finds out they have a compliance officer creating liability, they will force the board to act." I filed the complaint that night. 3 weeks later, I got a letter from the management company. It said, "The HOA board has received notice from their insurance carrier that continued harassment complaints could jeopardize coverage. The board is conducting an internal audit of all compliance actions over the last 12 months. All pending violations issued by the compliance officer are suspended pending the audit. All fines are waived. Residents who have been affected by compliance actions may submit a complaint to the management company for review." I felt a surge of relief, but I knew this was not over yet. The next board meeting was packed. Half the neighborhood showed up, and most of them were there to complain about Catherine. One resident said she had issued a citation for a broken mailbox flag and demanded an $80 repair fee. Another said she had threatened to tow his work van because it was parked in his own driveway overnight. A third said she had issued a citation for a trash can left out 15 minutes past collection time. The president opened the meeting and said, "We are here to review the compliance officer role and recent enforcement actions." Catherine stood and said, "I have done nothing but enforce the rules as written." The president said, "The problem is that many of these rules were not written, or they were written by you without board approval." Catherine said, "I have general authority to interpret the rules." The treasurer said, "That is not what your job description says." The president said, "We have reviewed the tow vendor invoices and we found that you authorized 37 tows over 6 months without board approval or a signed contract. We also found that the vendor gave you a personal referral bonus for each tow." Catherine said, "That is a standard industry practice." The president said, "Not when you are an HOA officer. That is a conflict of interest and possibly a kickback." Catherine said, "I am not going to sit here and be accused of corruption." She stood up and walked out. The board voted to terminate Catherine's role as compliance officer and to cancel the vendor relationship. The president said, "We will be drafting a new compliance policy with clear limits and oversight. All past violations issued without board approval are rescinded. All fines are waived. Residents may request a refund for any fines paid in the last 12 months." I felt the tension drain out of my body. My cousin leaned over and said, "You did it." The board also issued a formal no-contact directive. Catherine was prohibited from contacting me directly or posting about me in any HOA communication channel. If she violated the directive, she would be subject to a restraining order and possible legal action. 2 months later, I got a letter from the management company. It said the HOA had received a letter from the tow vendor terminating their services. The letter cited reputational risk and a pattern of staged enforcement actions that created liability. The vendor included photos Catherine had sent them, time-stamped before the alleged violations, showing cars in spots that were later claimed to be fire lanes or restricted zones. The vendor said they had been misled and that they would not work with Stonehaven again until a new compliance policy was in place. The board had to scramble for a new contract, and the new vendor required written authorization from 2 board members for every tow, plus photographic proof of the violation with visible signage or curb markings. Catherine moved out of Stonehaven 3 months later. I never found out where she went, but I heard from a neighbor that she had been asked to resign from the board after the insurance audit found additional undisclosed vendor relationships. The HOA issued a formal apology to every resident who had been cited by Catherine, and they refunded over $12,000 in fines. The new compliance policy required all rule changes to be published in writing at least 30 days before enforcement, and all violations had to be reviewed by the full board before a fine could be issued. I got a fine waiver in writing with a firm no-contact directive, and my parking spot has been empty of warning stickers ever since. Karen's own selective enforcement got documented in the minutes, and the HOA canceled the vendor relationship tied to the abuse. The board also revised the guest parking rules to allow same-day passes and removed the 24-hour advance notice requirement. Karen insisted it was a fire lane issue, but the actual curb markings and ordinance proved she was wrong, and the insurance audit forced the board to act before their coverage was pulled. I still see the stack of pre-filled violation forms in my mind sometimes, and I think about how close I came to losing my car, my job, and my reputation because one person decided to weaponize the rules. I will share another story next time.